I once thought to myself that, and I don't think it's really invalidated now, that in British politics, if you are to excel, you must conform either you must seem like a clergyman or like a bookie. I mean, those are the two great types.
But no mélange de genre.
No, no.
One or
and
the
a
other.
great many politicians are like clergymen or nonconformist ministers.
And above all, moralists.
Moralists, very much so.
And the bookies are the Harold Wilson types.
And Churchill. Churchill with his cigar and his gestures, he was an absolute perfect image of a very high-grade bookie. big turnover.
This program is a production of SICA. Funding for Firing Line is made possible by a major grant from the John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated. Additional support is provided by L. John Polite, Jr., the Friends of Firing Line, and by the financial support of viewers like you.
Our first meeting was in 1968, in February. It would be the first of many encounters, personal and on television. I knew much about him, knew also the extent to which he was attracted to mischievous formulations, as you will see here, when he speaks about Mussolini and Eleanor Roosevelt. But Malcolm Muggeridge was never the dilettante, at least not in the years I engaged him. His mind was on serious matter, and his background in journalism taught him to seek the means to attract the attention of those whose attraction isn't easily tendered in our hectic age of entertainment. But let's look at him 22 years before his death. We're in the lobby of the Savoy Hotel in London. We give you a few minutes of Mr. Muggeridge, but also the introduction to him, which reminds us of time and place and reputation.
From the Savoy Hotel in London, Firing Line with William F. Buckley, Jr.
Malcolm Muggeridge is a British institution, like the Home Office, against whose importunities he rails, like the monarchy, which he considers an extravagant anachronism. To imagine his counterpart in America, one would have to roll together Art Buchwald, Paul Goodman, Dwight MacDonald, and maybe just a touch of Simeon Stylites. That, in the opinion of some people, is altogether too many roles for one man to play. And accordingly, you will find here and there someone who believes that Mr. Muggeridge has lacerated the marginal book idea or institution. Usually it turns out that there is a close connection between the victim of one of Mr. Muggeridge's essays and the critic of Mr. Muggeridge, for instance, idolatry. But Mr. Muggeridge has survived. He survived criticizing Stalin during the 40s, the Queen during the 50s, and President Kennedy during the 60s. He is clearly imperishable. He calls himself a journalist, and here in England, that is a designation that one associates with Addison and Steele, with Walter Bagehot. It is what Chesterton insisted on calling himself. He worked first for the Manchester Guardian, which sent him to Moscow. That proved the worst trial the communists had since the mobilization of the White Army. Then he went to Calcutta for the New Statesman, then Washington for the Telegraph. Then he was editor of Punch, and in the past dozen years, he has freelanced, writing the book reviews for Esquire, doing television and radio, lecturing, writing books, and accepting briefly the rectorship of Edinburgh University. He calls himself a man of the left, for reasons we shall explore in a discussion of the culture of the left. His apostasies from the left are, however, so numerous as to leave him a member of the left in the same sense that, say, Bishop Pike is a member of the Christian Church. I should like to begin by asking Mr. Muggeridge, how did he hope to retain his credentials as a liberal after writing a year or so ago that history would prove that Mrs. Roosevelt did more damage than Benito Mussolini. Mr. Muggeridge.
Well, Bill, I think you must distinguish between being a member of the left and being a liberal. I regard liberalism as the great disease of our society. And when I said that that people like Mrs. Roosevelt, admirable though they were in intention, would be seen to have done more damage than people like Hitler and Stalin, I meant precisely that. Because Hitler and Stalin got a lot of people killed and precipitated a great war, but they are now discredited. But liberalism, which has been the dominant philosophy in the most influential and even powerful nations of the West, continues to thrive despite the fact that every time it's been applied, the consequences have been disastrous.
You therefore you distinguish between liberalism and leftism.
Left, yes, indeed.
And what, for instance, would be some of the critical distinctions between those two?
Well, I think when I say that I am a man of the left, I mean by that I am instinctively against authority and on the side, or hope that I would always wish to be on the weaker side.
Well, why would that make you distinctively a leftist?
Well, because I think that is what is good in the left position is precisely that. What's bad is its connection and sometimes identification with what you in America would call a liberal view of life. That's the bad side. The good side is an instinctive, almost chivalrous feeling that you should be on the side of the weak.
Well, would you say that there is a curious, then, congruity between the left as defined in England and the conservative as defined in America, who is singularly the opponent of authority, especially state authority?
Yes, I've always had a considerable sympathy with the right in America, considerable sympathy with you, as a matter of fact, Bill, whom I read fairly faithfully. I even had a considerable sympathy, I think I must have been almost alone in England in that, a considerable sympathy with Goldwater, as a human being and as a thinker. I remember being asked to explain this once in America, and it was impossible to explain it on philosophical grounds and the circumstances, so I contented myself with saying that I'd seen that Goldwater, that 1,200 American psychiatrists had said that Goldwater was potty, and therefore he was my man.
But a lot of people would, of course, consider this perverse, wouldn't they?
Oh, they would,
yeah.
Because I think the great curse of if I were asked to point to one thing which I think is the absolute curse of the 20th century, it is thinking in categories rather than thinking. Therefore you say a person belongs to the left. That means he must be in favor of abortion, he must love homosexuals, you see, all those things, which have nothing whatever to do with the position.
Well, why did you identify yourself as, quote, of the left, if you shrink from these categories?
Well, because I meant by that something quite definite, which to me is something admirable, and which would correct, it's the thing I like to say over to myself even, to make absolutely sure that one would never allow oneself to become caught up in any kind of association with authority, with those who are powerful.
Well, then, you are of the left, and you viewed, do I understand that you view the British left as having as its most striking common denominator the resistance of authority?
No, not at all. I think that in its tradition in which I was brought up, what I admire in it is precisely that. And of course, the trouble with the left is that it occasionally has to form governments. And as soon as it forms a government...
It's ruined.
Ruined.
Yeah.
I mean, you get a man like Wilson. I mean, he sets the left back by about 1,000 years, just by being prime minister.
Well, this may make him a considerable social philanthropist.
It may.
Well,
He's got to have something to be philanthropic with there. That's Wilson's trouble.
some years later, we met in the Sistine Chapel along with Princess Grace Kelly and David Niven and Charlton Heston in the Vatican, the site of Michelangelo's supreme masterpiece, the little chapel where popes are elected. We were investigating the parable in the Christian gospel, and Malcolm Muggeridge came forward with a parable of his own. Listen.
How can I know a neighbor?
Yeah.
A true neighbor. A neighbor is a man who shows compassion to his fellows. He's not just a man who happens to be living near, because, you know, that is meaningless.
No, but there is the antecedent question. Christ says, how shall we achieve eternal life? And he answers, by loving the Lord with all your heart and with all your strength, and your neighbor as yourself. So the Lord says, who is your neighbor?
Yes.
And he ends up with an illustration pointing to good men.
Yes.
Now, does that mean that you need not love non-good men as well as yourself?
It means that in order to find your neighbors, you must behave in a neighborly way. And then in behaving in a neighborly way, you will be loving your neighbors as yourself. I mean, to me, this is absolutely clear. He wasn't asking, I mean, he wasn't going to simply say to the lawyer, well, a neighbor is a man who happens to live next door to you or up the road. You must love him as yourself. Your neighbor is a man to whom you owe compassion, love, help. And insofar as you give it, you are loving your neighbor. Insofar as you don't give it, you're not loving him.
Maybe one of the lessons of the parables is that they lend themselves to a certain kind of exploration, but resist, and for very good reason, the kind of scrutiny that often takes all of the poetry.
That may well be so.
Let me ask you this. Yeah. Would you give me a parable which I wouldn't question the meaning of?
Well, I can say to you quite truthfully that this notion of parables has haunted me for years, partly because of a phrase of Blake's when he speaks of fearful symmetry. And I feel that these parables are detecting this fearful symmetry that is built into our mortal existence. Now, here's a parable for you. It came to me one day. I was actually watching a caterpillar in the path of my garden, a furry caterpillar. And I thought to myself, now supposing the caterpillars have an annual meeting, local society of caterpillars. They meet to discuss their affairs and how things are going. And my caterpillar that I happen to see, and he looks to me like a pretty old chap like me, that he, addressing them, says that, you know, it's an extraordinary thing, but we're all going to be butterflies. Okay, the caterpillars say, you poor fool. You're just an old man who's frightened of dying. You're inventing something to comfort yourself. All the things that people say to me when I say I'm looking forward to dying because I know that I'm going to go into eternity. You see? And so he, abashed, draws back, but in a short time, he's in his chrysalis. And sure enough, he's right. He extricates himself from that chrysalis, and he's no longer a creeper, which is what the caterpillars are. He's flying away.
The year now was 1986. Another segment from Firing Line, and then an exchange at Park Cottage, the little house in the country, where he lived and worked and probed with the delight written on his face the mysteries of life.
People who found in looking after a mongrel child some sort of spiritual enlightenment and joy which they didn't find, even in looking after their beloved, healthy children. You're taking that away from them because you say, we're a society, we don't want people like that. They're useless. But then I don't think anybody's useless. And I think that you're insulting all creation if you say, well, that's a cabbage, get rid of it. Or that's a wretched little fetus developing in some person who doesn't want it. Suck it out like with a vacuum cleaner and chuck it away. You see, I think when you get to that, you're getting into the Himmler world. You're getting into the Holocaust situation. And I'm against it all, Bill.
Well, I know you are, and I question only your insistence that as your teleological certitude that condition A has got to lead us to condition
Yes,
Z.
well, that has, of course, you must disagree with that.
And it's interesting that the cases I have recited have been cases in which that entity that interposed against mercy killing was the state. But I take it you think this is a state that is quickly going to adopt different
of course,
values.
but these things are done, you see, in order to create the precedent, provoke us and create the precedent on which you can construct the Holocaust. I mean, that's got to be. I remember very well being on one of these wretched television panels when the first of these things cropped up in England, you know, and a judge failed to sentence someone who'd murdered a sick relative, and I was the only person on the panel who said that, and they all turned to me and said, "You've got a heart of stone. I thought you were a humane man, and look at you." I said, "Wait, see what comes of this."
The position of Albert Camus on suicide is, by any standard, intolerable, right? Now, is it intolerable in the light of that Christian teaching which, as I began by quoting you as having recently quoted, that life in this world is life in a vale of tears?
Well, I don't think so, really, because I think the Vale of Tears image, first of all, it's not a good image. I prefer St. Teresa of Avila, who said life in this world is like a night in a second-class hotel. I think that's very good. But, you know, you can get sort of a bit sick of a second-class hotel and look elsewhere. But I think that the denigration of this world implicit in a Christian faith is not what it seems to be in materialist terms. In fact, I would say without any hesitation that it's in realizing that life in this world could be suitably compared to a night in a second-class hotel that I suddenly realized how incredibly beautiful and wonderful it is in itself beautiful and wonderful, because it contains all these extraordinary hints and intimations of what it's related to. In other words, the earthly city of St. Augustine is a grubby place, but once you see the city of God, its grubbiness somehow seems much less, much more bearable, because you know that every single thing in it, even the grubbiness, is related to this other city of God. And so you look for reality, and you try this and try that, and ultimately you arrive at the conclusion, great oversimplification, that reality is a mystery. The heart of reality is a mystery.
But even if that were so, why should that mystery lead you to Christian belief?
Because it leads you to God. The mystery, and I think the best expression for it I've ever read is in a book I'm very fond of, and I'm sure you know, called The Cloud of Unknowing. And it's when you are aware of the cloud of unknowing that you begin to know. And what you know, to simplify and put it very simply, is God. That's the beginning of faith, for me.
But that informal Christian teaching requires grace. But you seem to have described a purely deductive process.
No, because without the deductive process is the means, but faith and is the motive force that takes you there.
In other words, if as an observer you cease to observe, then you don't have that motive force that grace contributes.
Absolutely right. It is the grace. It's exactly like, Bill, it's exactly like falling in love. You see another human being, and for some extraordinary reason, you're in a state of joy and ecstasy over that person. But the driving force which enables you to express that and to bring it into your life is love. Without love, it's nothing, passes. It's the same with seeking reality. And there, the driving force we call faith. It's a very difficult thing to define, actually.
Well, why is it that, that scientists who devote themselves at least as avidly, professionally, as journalists, to seeking out the truth, so many of them don't stumble on this mystery?
The greatest ones do, incidentally. Einstein, Whitehead, people like that, the very highest names in science do stumble, and for precisely the same reason. Because the knowledge that they have through their researches is so limited, so fragile, so inadequate, that they too are forced to find some absolute.
Now, the use of the word mystery has been much disdained by skeptics as a too easy way to account for some of the hideous, anomalous tortures of history. The Holocaust, to take something on a macrocosmic scale, the 6-year-old little girl who dies of leukemia. At another scale, isn't it probably the case that such anomalies as these do more to encourage skepticism than anything in the divine order?
I don't think they discourage skepticism. They encourage skepticism. On the contrary, I would say that they encourage credulity, as a matter of fact. What they do is they present a dilemma to which reason provides no answer.
Yeah.
And you can only find that answer through what is called mysticism, or indeed through what Blake called the imagination, which is art.
Now, what did Blake mean by the imagination?
Well, he meant, putting it in one of my very favorite sayings of his, when he says, you know, because it's so like this very medium we're working in now, he says, they ever must believe a lie who see with, not through the eye. And he meant by imagination seeing through the eye, seeing into the meaning of things rather than seeing things.
How would Blake have seen through to such a phenomenon as I mentioned, the death of a 6-year-old child?
Because he would see, and there's some lines of history I can't quote exactly from memory, but joy and woe woven fine, a clothing for the soul divine. That, in other words, suffering, affliction, disappointment, failure, all these things are an integral part of the drama of our human existence. And without them, there'd be no drama. Let me tell you what would be a simple parable, which I've often thought of. Some very humane, rather simple-minded old lady sees the play King Lear performed, and she is outraged that a poor old man should be so humiliated, so made to suffer. And in the eternal shade, she meets Shakespeare. And she says to him, what a brutal thing that was, what a monstrous thing to make that poor old man go through all that. And Shakespeare says, yes, I quite agree, it was very painful. And I could, of course, have arranged for him to take a sedative at the end of Act 1. But then, ma'am, there would have been no play.
Well,
see my point?
Yes, I see your point. On the other hand, I'm not sure that King Lear wouldn't have preferred that there should not have been a play than that he should have lived through Acts 2 and 3.
But then he would have been a cowardly man, and of course he did in fact have to go through that suffering in order to understand why there had to be a play. And of course in that marvelous speech of his, one of my favorite things in all Shakespeare, you know, when Cordelia, he said, we two will go to prison, you know, and take upon us the mystery of things. It's a beautiful phrase and expresses exactly what I mean. This affliction has to be, and that of course is why one is drawn irresistibly, as a Western European, to the Christian faith and to Christ, because this is the central point, the cross. It's another parable I've often thought of. When St. Paul starts off on his journeys and he consults an eminent public relations man, so I've got this campaign and I want to promote this gospel. And the man would say, well, you've got to have some sort of symbol. You've got to have an image. You've got to have some sign of your faith, you see. And then Paul would say, well, I have got one. I've got this cross. And the public relations man would have laughed his head off. You can't popularize a thing like that. It's absolutely mad. But it wasn't mad. It worked for centuries and centuries, bringing out all the creativity in people, all the love and disinterestedness in people. This symbol of suffering. And I think that's the heart of the thing, and of course it's what has been lost. And why the faith is languishing, because it cannot take in that truth that we can learn nothing. And you know, as an old man, Bill, looking back on one's life, it's one of the things that strikes you most forcibly, that the only thing that's taught one anything is suffering. Not success, not happiness, not anything like that. The only thing that really teaches one what life's about, the joy of understanding, the joy of coming in contact with what it really signifies, is suffering.
He had said in one of the exchanges we've quoted from that he, quote, looked forward to dying because he knew it would lead him to eternity. When he did die, more than one obituarist recalled an address Malcolm Muggeridge gave to the American Society of Newspaper Editors in Washington in 1972, recalled especially his closing sentences. I doubt, he said, if I shall ever again address so large and eminent a gathering of fellow journalists, and like an older, superannuated clown on his last benefit performance, I should like to say something serious. Just that over the years, looking not very assiduously or systematically, but always looking for a light in a dark time, the only one I have ever found, shone first in Galilee. It is only for this reason, his faith in the future for all of mankind, that the death of Malcolm Muggeridge was bearable for his family and his friends.
Funding for Firing Line was made possible by a major grant from the John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated. Additional support is provided by L. John Polite, Jr., the Friends of Firing Line, and by the financial support of viewers like you. This program was produced by SECA, which is solely responsible for its content. For a printed bound transcript of this program, send $3 to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina 29250. Indicate the subject of the program, and please allow 3 weeks for delivery.
This is PBS.
William F. Buckley, Jr. offers 20 years of Firing Line guests from the 60s to the 80s. For $19.95, you can receive this companion book by calling 1-800-872-8188. Credit cards are acceptable. Or send a check to Firing Line, 2700 Cypress Street, Columbia, South Carolina, 29205.